Reagan mentioned that they are double-checked by an external agency, and she said that based on them being double-checked, that means they can't cheat. However, Iran still chooses the samples that they give to this agency, and they have 2 weeks to procure those samples. Now, what that means is essentially that they could do the same thing that someone might do in a drug test. Submit someone else's urine sample, and the agency isn't really going to know the difference. 2 weeks is enough time to gather a sample that doesn't have radioactive material and therefore circumvent the system. I'd also like to point out that with that first point of ease, she dropped the actual point of the deal text where it says that after 8 years, regardless of compliance, sanctions will be dropped. So Iran's going to wait it out because they know that whether or not they comply, the sanctions will be lifted after 8 years. So that gives them more incentive to do what they want to anyway, which is build these nuclear weapons so they can have hegemony in the region. In addition to that, there is no way, according to a Yale law professor and Bloomberg, for them to actually impose sanctions on small violations. The United States will not be able to do this pragmatically in actual practice. Now, on the second point about the track record, she said that Iran never signed anything, therefore never misrepresented themselves. However, they have verbally agreed to deals in the past. They have acted dishonestly when they covertly built 3 different nuclear sites. So we've seen that they have lied in the past. They have had these covert missions. And additionally, she dropped the analysis that 4 days ago, they violated a UN Security Council ban on ballistic missile tests. Iran has complete disregard for any of these international agreements because they are so focused on building up their nuclear program so they can have hegemony in the region. They've made it very clear that that's their aim, and they haven't backed down from that. In response to the third point about no trust, she said, Iran hasn't lied in the past, but again, covertly hidden 3 nuclear sites and lied about it in the past. That's 3 large examples where they have lied. And when you're looking at the fact that American sources that helped make the deal, as well as international sources, are saying that they don't trust Iran to keep up with it, it's more likely than not that Iran will cheat. Now, looking at her off case, she talks about disincentives. She mentions supporting Israel, and all that Israel needs is a cause for war. But in fact, even Israeli leaders do not like the Iran deal because they believe that it will not stop Iran. Netanyahu was very adamant about this when they were working on the deal. He felt that the United States was not adequately protecting their ally Israel because it would be too easy to cheat. And the former head of intelligence in Israel said that Iran will try to circumvent the deal. And again, the increasing presence hasn't stopped Iran in the past, will not continue to. And on the second point of verification, I got to that in response to her refutation. But again, the pathways are not blocked to the bomb because they still have these nuclear centers. They've done it in the past, and they've been able to do it covertly, and they still have control over those samples. It's based on trust, not verification. Vote affirmative. Thank you.
All right, another roadmap. I'm going to go over the top case, go over what my opponent said on her case, and I'm going to reinforce my own and give everyone some clear voters so you can feel extremely confident in the negative ballot. So we're looking at whether or not Iran will cheat, whether they're going to actually act dishonestly. The first thing we have to consider is the written deal with nuclear programs. We have to consider the type of disincentives with this. My opponent can talk about all these other deals, but we have to look at nuclear deals. They've never signed into one. She mentions verbal ones. These are completely different from that. Word of mouth is completely different from a written and signed contract, and acting dishonestly for some type of advantage when we're considering this. On balance, Judge, we have to consider that. Now, they can't hide radioactive material when you're looking at that. They don't actually get to sit here and choose each of these individual samples, go in their own little dark room and everything. It's verified by 2 different agencies, both by the P5 and by the International Atomic Energy Agency, something that I talked about. They have 2 different agents of verification for this to make sure that they're not doing that. And you can't hide radioactive material. Even if they take a sample that doesn't exactly fit in that, you can't just hide the fact that it was near radioactive material. Like the National Institute for Health says, it stays radioactive and is dangerous to the touch for 6 years. So even if it's something that's maybe not the most radioactive material, if it's right next to it, so maybe it's only dangerous for 3 years, 2 weeks right there isn't actually going to make that work. So it's not actually easy to break this. 2 weeks notice isn't going to circumvent the fact that radioactive material stays that way for 6 years, all things considered. And when we're looking at our second contention, talking about the track record, verbal is very different from written, and we have to hold that burden to the affirmative. We have to only consider that written word. We have to talk about actual nuclear deals. We can't make false comparisons to other types of deals that they made. That's not going to work in today's round. And the third is talking about trust. We can trust Iran to do the right thing, not because they want to, but because they have to in order to avoid these things, the disincentives that I'm talking about, because we support Israel, Judge, whenever we're considering this. We have increased our U.S. military presence. All Israel needs is a reason to go to war, and Iran breaking this means that they will go to war. So that's the first major disincentive, and the very first voter that the negative is going to provide for you in today's round is war with Israel. That's something that Iran wants to avoid. So not out of goodwill, but out of simple reason and out of simple logic, on balance, all things considered, when we're looking at this case today, Iran does not want to go to war with Israel. They're going to avoid this, and it's simply logical for them to do that and to actually do so, especially when they have different methods of verification. The second is going to be they will be sanctioned into the ground as a result. As I talked about before, they were sanctioned nearly $100 billion, and we can freeze their assets. We can ban their transactions with banks and financial institutions. We can take away their gas. We can take away their oil. These are all things that my opponent agrees on. Like, we can't actually do these things, and we have done them before. Whenever they break their promises, we actually can sanction them into the ground. So if they decide to break it in a little bit, I mean, they have a disincentive to do that because they will be financially punished as a result. They want to avoid this because you can't build weapons if you don't have money to build weapons. It's simply not possible. So my third major voter here, the third disincentive, is that they have both first and third party enforcement. Not only is the International Atomic Energy Agency a method of enforcement, it's also the P5, looking at the big names, looking at the United States, the European Union, France, Russia, and China. So they're going to tick off quite a few people. They're going to tick off Israel, they're going to tick off the International Atomic Energy Agency, they're going to tick off Israel, and they will be sanctioned into the ground. Those are three major reasons that Iran will not actually do this. You can't make these faulty comparisons, and all things considered. They don't have a track record of breaking their written deals, only verbal deals. That's the big difference between this deal and every other deal that they may have broken, and that's very important in today's round when talking about a written contract. It's very different from verbal agreements, and especially things that aren't even related to nuclear weapons. And furthermore, it's not even easy for them to do this. You can't hide the fact that you've been making nuclear weapons. You can't hide these types of things. You can't hide radioactive weapons or anything involved in that process anyway. So as far as it goes, for whether or not they break the deal within those first 8 years, that's just incentive for them to not do it that entire time, because they will be sanctioned into the ground for the next 8 years. Like, they don't want to be sanctioned at all. It's not like they're going to be like, oh, it's okay to be sanctioned now. They don't want to be sanctioned, period. So they're not going to break the deal. They don't want to go to war with Israel, period. So they're not going to break the deal. It simply doesn't make sense. The affirmative has quite the burden today, and that's the biggest thing. It's on the back of everyone's ballot. The affirmative in IPDA has the burden of proof, and this is a will cheat resolution. This is very much a resolution of fact with an extremely high burden on the affirmative. They have to prove conclusively, like not just looking at a couple pieces of evidence, but looking at quality of argumentation as well, to prove to you that without a doubt Iran will break this deal. And they haven't done so. They've shown you that they could, but that doesn't mean that they actually will. And that's the biggest thing to consider. And for these reasons, for the final time, I stand down for a negative ballot. Thank you.
All right, judges ready? All right, my last speech, I'm just going to go over the voters that Reagan brought up, and then I'm going to give you some of my own so you can feel comfortable voting affirmative today. So let's look at her first voter about the risk of war with Israel. She said that Iran is very afraid of that, but I want you to know that this isn't actually a real risk. If we look at Israel's leaders and the things that they have said about this deal, they believe that Iran has the upper hand if they break the deal. So Israel is very concerned that Iran will have the power in that, which is actually an incentive for Iran to break the deal. Because if Israel's leaders perceive that Iran has the upper hand, Iran knows we can break this deal and we'll be able to take over Israel. So the war with Israel there isn't really a risk. Reagan's second voter was sanctions. She said, we can do sanctions. That's a punishment. However, she mentioned even in her own case that we've been able to sanction Iran in the past. Hasn't kept them from building nuclear sites, hasn't kept them from doing any ballistic missile tests. They are very determined on their one purpose and their one goal to build this program. The sanctions haven't stopped. And in addition, the very text of the agreement says that those sanctions will be gone in 8 years, no matter what. Whether or not Iran even complies with the deal, the sanctions will end up being lifted at the same time, which gives Iran no incentive to stick to the deal. Her third voter is first and third party enforcement, and she talks a lot about the P5, but the P5 has no teeth in terms of enforcement. And then again, with the actual agency that's overseeing any of the inspections, we've seen that Iran still has the option to choose the sample. They have 2 weeks to determine it, and the Associated Press evidence reports that there have been side deals made with the International Atomic Energy Agency. If Iran is making side deals with the agency outside of that agreement, as I mentioned in my very first speech, that shows you that they do plan on circumventing the agreement. They do plan on cheating. So let's look at some voters. My first is going to be evidence. I provided a variety of sources, news sources, academic sources, international sources, people who actually work to create the deal, all saying the same thing, that we cannot trust Iran and that they will cheat in the future. When we're looking at this on balance, more likely than not, which is the res analysis and the weighing mechanism that my opponent agreed to, we have to see that with all of this evidence on the side of the affirmative, I've met my burden of proof. The second thing that I'm going to point out is precedent. We've seen Iran lie and cheat in the past. My opponent says we can trust Iran to do the right thing. The fact of the matter is we can't. 3 covertly built nuclear sites say otherwise. Third is priorities. Iran spent a long time working on this nuclear program. They're not just going to give it up over a couple of sanctions. They've worked past those in the past. The fourth is no incentive not to cheat. We've already seen the fact that they know the sanctions will be lifted, and so they don't have any incentive. The final voter that I have for you is that the leaders predicted and there are deals on the side. My opponent never touched the Associated Press evidence that they are making those side deals, and that's enough for an affirmative ballot. Thank you.
The judges are making their final evaluations.
We'll be back to find out the winner right after these messages.